This was Rome in the 18th century. It exerted this sort of magnetic pull on artists and collectors of all sorts, just in the way that Paris did in the 19th century and New York did in the 20th century. Goethe, in his Italian Journey, describes Rome as the hub of the world. It became to be seen as a city that was tainted with its Catholic associations, like that wonderful scene in Fellini's Roma, where there is the fashion show, which the models are nuns and priests and cardinals. And it was art historians like Tony Clark who really got people looking again at this very, very fertile culture. Rome has this extraordinary combination of classical antiquity and monuments built by Renaissance, Baroque and Rococo artists. This extraordinary map by Nolli shows Rome surrounded by the Aurelian walls, and the thing that strikes one about it is how much of ancient Rome within the walls was by the 18th century in fact rural. The Trevi Fountain, the Spanish Steps, the Quirinal Palace, all of these are 18th century monuments, and they are among the best loved things in Rome. And yet they sit side by side with the Forum, the Colosseum, and other sites of great interest for classical antiquity. One of the things we tried to do in this exhibition is to bring 18th century Rome to life. Rome is associated with, or has been for years, is the Grand Tour and the visitors who came to Rome from England and other countries, including America, in fact. But it was more than just a place where affluent, spoilt young men went. The indigenous Roman aristocracy, the priests, the popes, were all essential parts of the fabric of Rome. Described in many of the records of the travelers was the endless succession of festivities, operatic productions. People would go to the Vatican and other churches to hear sung masses with music composed by Allegri, and many of the Roman artists paint pictures of specific, very transient events, so sort of parties in the street, arrivals of ambassadors, arrivals of kings and queens. This very, very vibrant community included, interestingly, women. The daughter of the artist Carlo Moratti, Faustina, has a salon and was a famous poet and a leading light of the Arcadia circle in the beginning of the 18th century. And then the 18th century ends with Angelica Kauffman. Anthony Clark was one of the first art historians of modern day to really recognize her contribution. And he points out how she said, "My heart belongs in Rome. Rome is always in my thoughts." And successful as she was in England, where she really wanted to be was Rome. And that's where she went in the 1780s. She becomes friends with Goethe and Canova, and she gives the parties that were the parties to go to. She becomes incredibly successful. Looking at the objects in this exhibition, I'm made to think about is the evolution of some of the objects, because they begin as, in many cases, as ancient Roman objects, but they become, in a way, adapted or reconfigured by contemporary Roman artists, most famously Cavicetti. The other antiquities that were in Rome everywhere were Egyptian antiquities. And in the 18th century, there was a huge revival that predates by many years Napoleon's invasion of Egypt. And it derives from people looking at obelisks and other Egyptian monuments that were all over Rome at the time. One of the most interesting things about Rome in the 18th century was the drive to create encyclopedic museums. They were collections of art from all periods, but they were also museums of antiquity. Maybe the first museum ever was the Capitoline Museums that was formed in the 18th century and mounted by a series of members of the papacy. And then the second museum, which was actually at the Vatican itself, was really the product of the work of two popes, Pius and Clement, and that was known as the Pio Clementino. And Napoleon, when he is victorious in Italy, he has one of his artists called Vicar pick out works from the Italian museum, and then they get sent to Paris and become the nucleus of what becomes the Louvre, which is in fact based on the Italian prototype formed in Rome in the 18th century. After the defeat of the French at Waterloo, Antonio Canova, the great Venetian sculptor, is sent by the Allies to pick works to be restituted back to Italy. And maybe this is one of the earliest examples of restitution in the history of art in Europe. Rome also was a center of the study of art, and we're talking of the great century of the Enlightenment. Winckelmann was one of the great thinkers working for the Albani family and writing his great masterpieces about classical art. And those sorts of studies really laid the foundations for academies in Rome, and Tony Clark became a resident and a prime mover at the American Academy in Rome. Active in the 1960s and 1970s, he was a curator of the Metropolitan Museum, director of the museum in Minneapolis. This year is actually the centenary of his birth. He was known as Tony Bertoni, and he brought Bertoni to public attention. When he started working on Bertoni, there were 5 pictures by him in America. At the end of his career, there were over 70. We have, for example, been able to borrow from the National Gallery in Washington a selection of his incredible notebooks in which he compiled all sorts of information about Italian artists, Italian patrons, Italian pictures in public collections. He was really the vanguard of the rediscovery of 18th century Roman culture, and we commemorate his achievements in this exhibition.